Shabbat shalom. The Torah is all about crossing over this week. The Israelites face turbulent waters ahead with an army in pursuit behind, and then the waters somehow part. And we wonder about that, don't we? How it is that our paths take us to places that they do. And we worry, will the waters part? I'm thinking about this part of the human condition. How do we find ourselves in the places we do? And why do so many of us, assuming it's not just me, worry about whether or not we are on the right path? It may have something to do with the fundamental complexity of just being alive. Typically, the Exodus story is understood as a national story, our community liberation story. And it is. But it's also a story that can hold the deeply personal, a story in which we can each see our lives represented. There's a few key moments that I'd like to draw your attention to tonight that reflect that theme. First, the Pharaoh who changed his mind about letting Israel go. After the catastrophe of the death of the firstborn Egyptians, including losing his child, he finally relented, and the Israelites and the Erev Rav, as the Torah describes it, the many others who joined them, were freed from bondage. But shortly after our ancestors begin the journey back to the promised land, Pharaoh reconsiders. Ma zot asinu, he cries out. What have we done? Asks the Pharaoh. And while I'm not interested in sympathizing with the guy who enslaved our ancestors, there is something, I think, relatable about a sudden sense of regret. Oi, what have I done? In my case, and perhaps this is true for some of you, I tend to experience fear of regret more than regret itself. If I do this thing I am considering, if I walk this path, will I regret my choice? If I make a change, what happens if the unknown isn't good? What will I then do? Here's the thing. Pharaoh seems to react in a panic. Ma zot asinu, what have we done? And he swiftly attempts to undo his decision to free the enslaved Israelites. Of course, it doesn't work, and in his panic, he ultimately loses much more. From this, we can learn that there has to be a kind of letting go that Pharaoh was not capable of. Letting go of the fear that can cause us to react quickly and without thought. Letting go of that thing that might lead us to close off whatever had previously led us to a place of being more open to the possibility of change before we shut down that expansiveness inside us. Another moment of wisdom in this parsha is found in the well-known Midrash, the tradition of rabbinic stories that comes from the ancient Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael about Nachshon ben Aminadav. You've probably heard this story, and it goes that when the Israelites stood at the shore of the sea and were told to enter with faith and that the waters would part, most were too frightened to do so. In what may be a more general critique of over-reliance on prayer, the Midrash even describes God chastising Moses for praying too much and not just jumping in. Quoting God as saying, "My loved ones are drowning in the sea, and the sea is raging, and the foe is pursuing. And you're standing here praying? Nu?" I added the nu. Finally, while Moses is busy davening, Nachshon takes a literal leap of faith and is the first to jump into the waters that have not yet parted. Usually we say that this act of faith is what caused the waters to part. It's certainly how I've heard the story over the years, but I decided to actually read the Midrash, and it's interesting. After Nachshon jumps in, the waters don't part right away. Eventually, Moses raises his staff and does his Moses thing, and the waters part. But in the meantime, the Midrash ascribes the words from the 69th Psalm to Nachshon, who has just risked it all, not knowing what will happen. The rabbis imagine that Nachshon uttered these words as he struggled to stay afloat. "Deliver me, O God, for the waters have reached my neck. I am sinking into the slimy deep, and I find no foothold. I have come into the watery depths. The flood sweeps me away." And so the simple way to understand this story is that we sometimes have to take the first step without being sure of the outcome. And that's true. But Nachshon does that. He is the first to jump into the waters, and yet, at first, he almost drowns. It is Moses, not his jump, that eventually parts the sea. The water nearly overtakes him. And I can imagine him trying to stay afloat and wondering to himself if he had, in fact, been brave or if he had just been very foolish. And I think that's more often how it goes. We decide to do a hard thing and we take the first jump, and then it feels like the waters will overtake us. Like we can't find our footing, like we are in a slimy deep, as the psalmist describes. And perhaps this is why the tradition lauds Nachshon so much. Not because he was willing to jump, but because he knew that jumping involved great struggle and risk and discomfort before things got better, if they would get better. Okay, one more moment of human complexity to focus on. As we retell at Seder tables each year, the Israelites do make their way across the sea, and when they get there, they sing with joy. We just sang Micha Mocha. That was part of the song that they sang. Shabbat Shirah is a dedication to that sublime moment. And it's not just the Israelites who experience joy, but also, according to the Midrash, the angels are exuberant about the death of the Egyptians as God closed the sea over them, cheering for their downfall. It's hard to blame this pleasure-taking. There can be something just so gratifying about watching those who have done bad things get their due. But God sees it differently and rebukes the angels, saying, "My creations are drowning, and you are singing before me?" So sometimes we make a choice to make a change because it's the right thing, ending a marriage or a long-term relationship, for example. If we make this change, even in part because the other party has in some way been hurtful to us, perhaps we might also find ourselves singing like the angels. Maybe singing that line from Chicago, "He had it coming, he had it coming," right? And I get it. A colleague reminded me of that very song when someone else, not at our temple, did indeed have it coming. And I loved it. I drove around, I listened to that song a couple times, and I took pleasure. But ultimately, it doesn't serve us. The notion that every single person is one of God's creations can help orient ourselves away from the Schadenfreude and instead to that oh so difficult but important junction of gratitude and empathy for the pain of others. Gratitude for our own blessings. Life is fundamentally about navigating change and growth. May our paths lead us to beautiful places of wilderness and wandering, to Sinais that shine light upon the truth we seek, and to promised lands flowing with milk and honey. Shabbat Shalom.